Whenever we think of either the United Kingdom or France, we mostly think of their European territory here and here. However, we tend to forget a tremendous amount of territories that these countries also hold throughout the world, making their territories stretch into North and South America, the Caribbean, Africa, Oceania, and even the Pacific Ocean. These territories, mostly consisting of islands, save a couple exceptions we'll learn about, are the remnants of two of history's largest colonial empires. Because as Britain and France lost their respective empires throughout the 19th and 20th century, there were some territories that they were able to keep, either because the locals voted to remain under their control, thus legitimizing their ownership of the land, or the locations, in this case the islands, were deserted upon arrival, and so there were no natives that they colonized, simply empty land that they truly discovered and annexed. So in this video, we're going to take a look at which these territories are for each of them, and how the United Kingdom and France have effectively got to keep part of their colonial empires up to today. First, let's take a look at the world map, which shows us each of these overseas territories of both countries, the one I used on the thumbnail. Now, save French Guiana and Gibraltar, all of the British and French overseas territories are islands. These islands were either discovered or conquered from natives, most of them during the period of European colonialism, although some a little bit later. In these cases, I believe all were deserted upon discovery, and they're first concentrated in some specific areas. First, the Caribbean, where the UK has 6 islands and France has 4, plus 1 up north in Canada and French Guiana in South America. In the southern Atlantic, Britain also holds 4 territories, which each have various islands. The Falklands stand out due to their disputed nature. France has no territories here, but they do have them on the other side of Africa in the western Indian Ocean. Around and south of Madagascar, they have Mayotte, Réunion, and their southern and Antarctic lands, while Britain only has 1 small territory in the Indian Ocean. In the Pacific, France has 4 sets of islands, one of which being huge, French Polynesia, while the UK only has 1. And finally, in the Mediterranean, the UK also controls Gibraltar, as well as some territories in the island of Cyprus. So now we can go territory by territory to understand why they got to keep it up to today and how their governance of that land works. Let's go west to east, starting on the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean has 4 sets of French possessions and 1 British one, all of these being islands. The British one are the Pitcairn Islands, officially the Pitcairn, Henderson, Ducie, and Oweno Islands. They are 4 volcanic islands and the only British possessions in the Pacific Ocean, but only Pitcairn itself is inhabited. They were first settled by Polynesian people, but they left, and the islands were uninhabited when the Portuguese and Spanish first discovered them in 1606. The British sighted them only over 100 years later, naming it after the crew member that sighted it, a 15-year-old named Robert Pitcairn. Some settling began, but it only became an official British colony in 1838. What's interesting is that the first settlers descend from British mutineers and their Tahitian consorts, which causes the island to have these two mixed ethnicities up to today. As of 2020, only 47 people live there, and it remains under the control of the British because, well, they can't really survive on their own, and they were British to begin with. France, however, has 4 sets of islands. First, Clippertorn Island, not too far off the Mexican coast. This one is unpopulated, and it's more of a rock/atoll with a lagoon in the middle of it. Clipperton was documented by French merchant explorers in 1711 and formally claimed as part of the French Protectorate of Tahiti in 1858. Mexico eventually claimed it, with the matter being internationally arbitrated in 1931 by the Italian king, who ended up granting it to France. Some scientific and navy expeditions take place there, but not much else. It does, however, grant France a good area of exclusive economic zone, so essentially sea territory around it, which I believe is one of the main reasons behind them wanting to keep all of these territories throughout the world, the potential of sea resources. France's EEZ would be reasonably small if it consisted only of its European territory. However, as we can see on this map, it takes up a very decent amount of the world through their overseas territories, mostly being islands. The same happens for the United Kingdom. Their European territorial waters are slightly bigger than France's, but they become much larger when overseas islands are considered. Another French Pacific territory, I believe the largest, is French Polynesia. 121 dispersed small islands and atolls, 75 of which are inhabited by a large population of around 279,000 people. Although 240,000 of which live in the Society Islands, of which the biggest is Tahiti, their flag also looks pretty cool in my opinion. The islands were initially settled by native Polynesians, with Spanish, British, and French fighting over who would get to colonize them. In 1842, Tahiti and Tauata were declared a French protectorate and slowly came to annex all of the surrounding islands. A fun fact, in 1940 when Germany invaded the conquered France, French Polynesia sided with the Free France Army and resisted. It's the only country associated with the French Republic, so they have their own president and government, also I believe their own currency, but still having the title of a French overseas collectivity, the local government has no competence in justice, education, security, or defense, areas which are directly administered by the government of France. In addition to these, France also controls 2 additional territories in the Pacific, but these are closer to Australia, New Caledonia, and Wallis and Futuna. Wallis and Futuna are also an overseas collectivity consisting of a set of islands, Uvea, Nukuata, and Faya, plus small atolls around them, the Wallis Islands, and then Futuna and Alofi. Today it has around 11.5 thousand people. The French were the first Europeans to settle there, with the arrival of missionaries in 1837 who converted the population to Catholicism. In 1842, those missionaries asked for the protection of the French state after an uprising by local population. In 1887, the Queen of Uvea and the kings of Sivabo and Alo signed a treaty officially establishing a French protectorate, remaining up to today. New Caledonia is nearby, and Wallis and Futuna was actually initially under their colonial administration. They're an archipelago which consists of the main island of Grande-Terre, the Loyalty, Chesterfield, Bellup, and Penis Islands, plus a few small and remote islets. Apparently the northern islands population is mostly of native descent, while the southern ones are mostly of European descent. In 1853, under orders from Emperor Napoleon III, Admiral Fébrier de Pont took formal possession of New Caledonia, with it initially being a penal colony. Europeans brought new diseases such as smallpox and measles, which caused the deaths of many natives and helped the French take control of that population. In 1946, New Caledonia became an overseas territory, and by 1953, French citizenship had been granted to all New Caledonians, regardless of their ethnicity. Some intense protesting and fighting for independence took place by the remaining natives in the 1980s, and this led to an agreement for the transfer of autonomy and an independence referendum. The vote took place in 2018, and they chose to remain with France, a result confirmed in 2020 and 2021, although in 2021 pro-independence factions didn't vote in protests. So that wraps up possessions in the Pacific. Let's move on to the Atlantic Ocean. First, up north, the French own Saint-Pierre and Miquelon on the coast of Canada, an archipelago of 8 islands. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is a vestige of the once vast territory of New France, today having around 6,000 people. The fact that France controls it is precisely a result of their old colonial empire in North America. After they lost most of the land, I made a whole video about when and how they were able to keep this island in agreement with the British. Since the British controlled Canada until so late, the Canadians never tried to get it, and so it remains French. While the British control Bermuda, reasonably close to the coast of the US, Bermuda is actually an archipelago consisting of 181 islands, although the most significant ones are connected by bridges and appear to form one landmass of only 54 square kilometers, but home to 64,000 people. Black Bermudians, descended from African slaves, make up around 50% of the population, while white Bermudians of British, Irish, and Portuguese descent are 30%. It's a self-governing parliamentary democracy dating from 1620, making it one of the world's oldest legislatures, although their head of government is formally appointed by the governor, who is nominated by the British government as the representative of the British monarch. They are pretty much self-ruling, and the UK is only responsible for foreign affairs and defense. It was deserted upon discovery and always ruled and populated by the British, so no independence was ever attempted. Then we have the Caribbean, which I believe is the highest concentration of European-controlled territories outside of Europe. There's even a couple more if we include the Netherlands, and one of the French islands is actually shared with them. France controls 4 sets of islands, the UK 5, and the Dutch 6, but we won't get into those here. Let's start with the British. The Cayman Islands are also self-governing, under British control since 1670, and having around 70,000 people. They were first granted to England along with Jamaica through the 1670 Treaty of of Madrid, which sought to settle all territorial disputes in the Americas between Britain and Spain. Eventually Jamaica became independent, but they didn't. Turks and Caicos are British too. The islands were inhabited for centuries by indigenous peoples. The first recorded European sighting of them was in 1512. In subsequent centuries they were claimed by several European powers, with the British Empire eventually gaining control. When the Bahamas gained independence in 1973, the islands received their own governor and have remained an autonomous territory ever since. There was some talk of joining Bahamas in their independence in 2010, but nothing came of it. Anguilla and Montserrat as well, along with the British Virgin Islands, originally inhabited by Arawak and Carib peoples. Anguilla became a British colony after English settlers arrived in 1650. It was temporarily independent as a part of the West Indies Federation, but its resentment towards St. Kitts dominating the Federation led them to return to British rule. The stability and growth that came next led to them remaining as such up to today. Montserrat was first settled by Irish fishermen in 1632, who invited the French to rule, maybe to annoy the British. However, English control of the island was confirmed under the Treaty of Breda in 1667. In the late 1900s, they spoke of independence, but never moved towards actually demanding it. The British Virgin Islands, the rest are American, became British in 1672 with the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The Dutch had previously had a lot of influence there. They've remained British ever since, with, as all other territories, slowly gaining increased autonomy and self-rule. In addition to these territories under their direct control, the British also have something worldwide called the Commonwealth of Nations, many of which are in the Caribbean, and despite a lot of them being independent countries, it still connects them to the UK and provides some British influence over them. In this map, we can see those in red. Then the French Caribbean, starting with Saint Martin. Saint Martin is the island that France shares with the Netherlands. It's split horizontally at about halfway. Since both countries are in the EU, there's no effective border. It has around 75,000 people, slightly more than half on the Dutch side. It was first settled by the Arawaks, were then driven out by the Caribs. In 1648, France and the Netherlands agreed to divide the island between the two territories. With the signing of the Treaty of Concordia, it's crazy how this diplomatic compromise goes this far back. Most of the natives died or left during European conquest, so European control has remained. Some people on both sides have wanted to join up as an independent state, but that hasn't really materialized. Then St. Barthelemy, also known as St. Bart's. Interestingly, St. Bart's voted to secede from the other French colony of Guadeloupe, not to become independent, but rather to form their own overseas department, still under French control. Its capital is Gustavia, named after a Swedish king. It's the only Caribbean island that was a Swedish colony for any significant length of time, almost 100 years, then returning to the French after a referendum. It was also temporarily ruled by the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. They voted to be under French rule twice. I guess they really wanted to remain French. It was never inhabited permanently by natives and only became a permanent settlement from 1648 onwards with French colonization. Guadeloupe is nearby, an archipelago of 6 islands, all of which are inhabited. The same logic applies here. They were first settled by the Arawaks, were kicked out by the Caribs, then they were kicked off by the Spanish. In 1626, French soldiers expelled Spanish settlers. By 1674, it was an official French colony. There were some disputes with the British, who also wanted it, but the French came out on top. And also Martinique. The French settled it first in 1635. Both the Dutch and British tried to conquer it, but to no avail. Most of the natives were either killed or kicked out of the island by the French. However, today, most of the population are descendants from the African slaves they brought there, about 80%. This seems to be a trend in many of these Caribbean islands. And we can't fail to mention French Guiana, arguably the biggest example of a remnant of a colonial empire today. French Guiana is the second largest region of France, fully integrated and a part of the EU. It's the only territory on the continental mainland of either North or South America that is still under the sovereignty of a European state. The first French establishment was recorded in 1503, that's really early, but France didn't establish a durable presence until colonists founded Cayenne in 1643. Colonization efforts continued failed until 1804, when they developed it into a penal colony. Instead of decolonizing it like the British and Dutch did with their Guianas, France chose to integrate it, seemingly to the will of the locals. In the South Atlantic, the British have 4 sets of territories comprising more islands. First, the Falklands. Despite being under British control, the Argentines claim it through the argument that they were owned by Spain when Argentina became independent from them, and so they should have been transferred to them as well. They were uninhabited until 1764, and the French were actually the first settlers, although the British came later in 1766. Then Spain arrived too in 1770. This chart is good to understand who really controlled them and when. As we see, this time between 1800 and 1840 is where the dispute comes from. In the first half of the 20th century, the Falklands served an important role in Britain's territorial claims to sub-Antarctic islands and a section of Antarctica. It has around 3,600 people, most of which of British descent, and they seem to want to remain British. Then Saint Helena, Ascension, and Tristan de Cunha, all of which were discovered by the Portuguese explorers that began traveling down the African coast in the early 16th century. Despite their alliance with the Portuguese, English warships began to wade in the area to attack Portuguese carracks on their way home from India to capture valuable trading goods. The Dutch claimed them, but abandoned their settlement, and the islands were finally settled by the British themselves in 1657. The island of St. Helena became internationally known as the British government's chosen place of exile for Napoleon Bonaparte, who was detained on the island from 1815 until his death in 1821. Each of the 3 islands was its separate colony, only beginning to join together in 1922. Given that their population is almost exclusively British, it makes sense that it remains under British control. South Georgia and the Sandwich Islands are to the southwest. The UK claimed sovereignty over South Georgia in 1775 and the South Sandwich Islands in 1908. Just like the Falklands, Argentina claimed both of them. No one lives in South Sandwich Islands and very few live in South Georgia. The only dispute is with Argentina, but as we've seen, UK sovereignty remains assured. And finally, the British Antarctic territories. Inhabited only by the staff of research and support stations and consisting only of their claim on Antarctica per se since 1962. Due to the Antarctic Treaty, no claim can be asserted in the continent, so their control is subjective, but it does take place. On the other side of Africa are the French possessions in the Indian Ocean, most of which exist around Madagascar, also a former French colony. First, Mayotte. It's crazy to think how most of these regions are a part of the EU and use the euro, despite being so far away from Europe. The island was populated from neighboring East Africa with the later arrival of Arabs who brought Islam. A sultanate was established in 1500, but it then became an official French colony through conquest in 1843. Mayotte chose to remain with France after the rest of the archipelago. The Comoros declared its independence following the 1974 referendum. The Comoros continues to claim it, but in 2009 they voted again to remain French. Then Réunion. Colonization started in 1665 when the French East India Company sent the first settlers, therefore having no natives to claim independence as their own nation. Today, the greatest proportion of the population is of mixed descent, while the predominant language is Réunion Creole, though French remains the sole official language. And finally, the southern and Antarctic lands. With almost no people, at most 300 in the summer, most of whom are researchers, this territory includes not only their claim on Antarctica per se, plus these 3 nearby islands, but also some of the smaller ones around Madagascar. I believe all of these were empty upon discovery, and so no one else has claimed them other than France. The British only have 1 small Indian Ocean territories in the Chagos archipelago, used for a military base of both the US and the UK. The islands are claimed by Mauritius because they were a colony together, but the British kept Chagos after Mauritian independence. The only inhabitants are the military personnel, and the UK has compromised into giving the island back to Mauritius once its military purpose has been served. And their last 2 overseas territories are in the Mediterranean, in Gibraltar and Cyprus. Gibraltar has been British since 1713, ceded to them under the peace treaty which followed the War of Spanish Succession. Spain sometimes has claimed it, but to no avail. Cyprus was taken from the Ottomans by the British, and when they became independent, they kept a few military bases there, something I believe is still allowed simply due to the dispute of the islands with the Turkish protectorate up north. So, those are the remnants of the British and French colonial empires, and effectively how they got to keep parts of them up to today, while other countries like Portugal or Spain decolonized entirely, losing all their overseas possessions, with the exception of islands near Europe. The reasons for the maintenance of these territories likely has to do with both the strategic importance of their locations and the desire of both countries to remain global actors, as well as the natural resources available in them, not only at land, but also, and I would say especially, in the surrounding territorial waters. Not to mention the fact that if they are or were deserted, no other nation has a claim to them, and if they are populated, these populations have more often than not voted to remain under British or French control. Are there any other examples of countries that kept part of their colonial empires? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.